Hi, everyone. My name is Devin. I work at the Worcester Public Library, and today I am joined by Dr. Ellis Jones. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Jones.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
Dr. Jones is an assistant professor of sociology at the College of Holy Cross in Worcester. His research focuses on understanding the relationship between ethical consumers and corporate sustainability. He's the author of the Better World Shopping Guide, 6th edition, and a co author of the Better World Handbook in its 2nd edition. He has more recently created a number of free smartphone apps, both in iOS and Android, for the general public. The apps focus on corporate, political, and media transparency, including the apps include Better World Shopper, Eco Report Card, Voter Glass, and Media Glass. Okay, you're a busy guy, so thanks for taking time for the interview today, Dr. Jones.
My pleasure.
So my first question, it seems like you've been rating companies for a while, and when you start looking into an organization, at this point, you probably have an idea of what to expect or what you'll find. But what about when you were just starting out, or maybe when you're researching a new category for your consumers? Has there ever been a time that you were shocked by what you discovered about a company? And if so, could you give us an example?
Sure. Well, I mean, to be honest, I've had many shocks in this research. It's just always full of surprises. When I first started out, I think in graduate school back in 2000, I was inspired by an issue of Sierra Club, puts out a magazine called Sierra, and they had an issue dedicated to rating how polluting different petroleum refineries were for gas stations, gas brands that you would go and fill up your car with. And I found it fascinating, right, that they had data on these refineries and how the refineries how polluting they were. This inspired the whole project actually. And I started collecting all kinds of data, and I looked at, for example, their philanthropic activities, and I found ExxonMobil gives millions a year to something called the Save the Tiger Fund, and I found that really interesting. And then it looked like they all had philanthropic activities, and pretty soon I found that uh, I think at first glance you would think, oh well, petroleum companies, that's a filthy industry, right? It's very polluting and terrible, so they're all the same, but they're not. Some are incredibly, incredibly irresponsible. And while they all might be producing something that is very destructive to the environment and climate change and so forth, they are definitely not all the same. So in my research, I found that ExxonMobil was by far the worst of the petroleum companies, and funded decades worth of junk science research. Was the last to admit climate change even existed, more very recently. All of and so there were, other petroleum companies, while they weren't angels by any means, that there was so much of a distinction between the rest of the pack and ExxonMobil. And all of these data that I've collected over time has really clarified that picture even more. And I think to this day, ExxonMobil comes out as the number one most destructive company on the planet, and I rate over 2,200 companies
Wow.
worldwide. So I'm always finding surprising. Like a couple of years ago, in the next to the most recent edition, I found that the most responsible company that I could track was a craft brewer, New Belgium out of Colorado. I had no
Wow.
idea that beer was going to be the number one and, petroleum, number 2000. So there are always surprises.
Definitely sounds like it. Well, as I mentioned, and you did too, you've published Better World Handbook, more than one edition of Better World Shopper, and you have the Better World Shopper website and app now as well. Obviously, you've been getting lots of positive feedback from consumers and fans, but have you seen any corporate shifts taking place since beginning your project on rating?
Yeah, in fact, this is one of the most consistent requests from my readers over time has been, well, we've been doing this for a while. Have any companies actually changed? And I'll say that many companies have changed, and some for the better and some for the worse. And I don't think we have data on whether or not they're reacting to, for example, my readers or this kind of work that I do personally. But I can tell you this, there are all kinds of data that they are reacting to consumers writ large who are demanding more ethical practices, more socially and environmental responsible behaviors, etc. And so in this latest edition, I have a couple of new charts, which I've never had before, including the 10 biggest success stories, which are companies that improved their grade the most between the first edition in 2006 and this latest edition, and also the 10 biggest disappointments. So companies that have fallen in the other direction. And it's it's a sort of an endlessly fascinating endeavor to see which ones are going up and down. Every now and then they also contact me, and I get to know some of the companies through just, it's not very scientific, but it's an anecdotal data. So I'll talk to the sustainability manager at the former Office Depot, or I will get a call from the head of the North Central Division of Nestle's water branch for bottled water, and or I'll get a letter from Coca-Cola or Disney, or I'll get emails from some little green companies that didn't know they were being recognized for what they were doing, and saw me list them in my work as one of the better companies, and so wanted to reach out to me. So there's all kinds of little anecdotal evidence about how this kind of work impacts corporations.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. And I like the idea of the successes chart. I think that would be something really interesting to see. I read that you traveled a lot and lived in different places for your research, including places in Europe, Asia, and Central America. So I was wondering how traveling abroad has influenced your research.
In some ways, it was really my connections to people in other countries that gave me this framework to think about the idea of making the world a better place. The first book I put together, the Better World Handbook, was about this, and then the shopping guide came later. And all of these projects are essentially wrapped around this idea that we cannot just take care of ourselves or even just our families or just our communities. It's not enough. We have to take care of all of us. We have to care about all of us on this planet. And so I think those experiences living and studying and working abroad have been wonderful reminders that the people that end up suffering the impacts of some of our collective decisions or participating in the supply chains of some of our most commonly purchased goods are real people. And I've lived with some of them, and I have connections to some of them, and some of them are like family to me. And I think this just serves as a constant reminder that this kind of work is really important. It's very easy, I think, for us to have difficulty imagining what it is like to be on the other end of some of these companies, because our end looks a lot like Amazon images and fast food outlets or going to the supermarket. And there are real people throughout this process, and I think it's important that we keep that in mind.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. And that's something I've been thinking about as the environmental movement's really grown, how it's showing that, if we pollute, it affects someone on the other side of the world with a natural disaster and the supply chains, and it's all tangled together. So one of your apps, the Eco Report Card, I saw that the companies there are rated based on their social and environmental impacts. So when I looked it up, I expected it just to focus on environmental because of the EECO name. But I noticed, I wasn't sure what inspired you to put those two together.
So, since the beginning, I've been interested in trying to create a system of transparency and accountability that holds companies accountable for all of their behavior. And that includes social and environmental impacts. In fact, once I began researching in this general, I found that early on in the 70s and 80s, companies began to create things called CSR reports or corporate social responsibility reports. And they always have combined the social and environmental impacts into those reports. Now it's much more common to see them called sustainability reports. And so there's been a shift in general, both I think at the consumer level and at the corporate level, to emphasize environmental impacts more, but they always still include social impacts as well.
Okay.
And so all of my work tries to take all of those issues into account, and I try to go a little bit beyond them. So I look at impacts on our political system, impacts for the welfare of animals, impacts for local communities, impacts on social justice issues, to dig a little bit deeper into some of these areas outside of the most commonly thought of areas of, for example, its impact on climate change.
Mhm. Speaking of climate change, on Saturday, February 20th, you'll be moderating a virtual discussion for our library about the book The Story of More: How We Got to Climate Change and Where to Go From Here by Hope Jahren. As someone who researches environmental issues, why do you think Jaren's book is important?
So I think it's important for a couple of reasons. The first and foremost reason would be that it's important for academics in particular, and she is a fairly well regarded scientist, to communicate directly to the public. I myself am a public sociologist, and so a part of my commitment is communication with the general public, to not keep the knowledge within the ivory tower, to not keep it going back and forth between academics or scientists, or even just between the professor and the student, but rather to communicate this knowledge outwards so that we can do something about it as a larger public. So when I read Jaren's work, the first thing that strikes me is how accessible it is. It's such easy reading. It's so wonderfully translated for just anyone to pick up and access immediately. She does such a wonderful job of humanizing this issue. And there are many aspects of this issue that are communicated in many ways, but this ability to reach out to almost anyone with her work is just so sorely needed in this area. In addition to that, I feel like she does a great job at the end of trying to encourage people to begin to think about how they can make changes to help contribute to the solution. This has always been a thorn in my side. I've seen so many documentaries and I've read so much work and so many books on this issue. And when there is not a thoughtful focus at the end of those documentaries or books or even journal articles on how we can step forward and be a part of the solution, I feel like it inadvertently contributes to a sense of powerlessness and hopelessness and cynicism. Again, not intentionally, but because most people don't feel trained or qualified or skilled enough to offer up actions that people can take. And I think that's what we're hungry for. We want to make this better.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually avoid some nature documentaries because they do make me sad because they don't offer ways to help. So it's nice that Jarin offers some solutions for us. I watched one of your interviews where you said that the environmental movement in the 90s inspired you with your work now. So, since the 90s, obviously, I think we've learned a lot more about climate change and seen the effects of natural disasters. How do you think the environmental movement has changed as awareness and urgency grows?
I remember back in the 90s, while the environmental movement was fairly popular, there were complaints that there was there was too much urgency in the messages and people didn't feel like the issues were very urgent. And I think we have found ourselves in, almost the exact opposite situation now, which is that there is such widespread recognition, globally speaking, that climate change is as urgent and as difficult and as destructive and as massive as a problem gets for humanity in the environmental realm. That we can't be urgent enough, right? We really, what we need is a time machine to go back 30 years and start changing things 30 years ago for now. And so the issue is no longer that, should we really be um, painting a picture that is so dark around the environment, but the picture is already so dark. How can we, despite being so late in coming to these ideas, how can we engage earnestly and effectively in being a part of the solution for a problem that we can no longer escape?
Yeah, that makes sense. For a lighter question, it seems like you do a lot of research and study a lot of data. What do you do for fun?
Oh boy. During the
Maybe I shouldn't
pandemic,
have asked.
the options are limited. So recently, I have been picking my guitar back up again. When I was very young, I played a little classical guitar and then taught myself, all of the old classic rock stuff. So I play
That's
my
great.
guitar, and sometimes I have fun recording funny songs with my kids using little voice synthesizer apps. And I have also been playing probably more video games than I should, uh, because I can't get outside as much. I would otherwise try to travel and get outdoors a bit more. But particularly during the winter in New England, it can be tricky during a pandemic, and so um, I think I do enough fun things to keep me sane, to keep this work reasonable.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on the PS4 during the first 6 months of the pandemic, so I understand the video games. Well, if you've enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Jones as much as I have, make sure to sign up for our upcoming community book discussion on the story of Moore, how we got to climate change and where we go from here. He'll be moderating for us, and that's on Saturday, February 20th, and the time is 2:30 to 3:30. So make sure to sign up for that, and we'll see you then. Thanks so much, Dr. Jones.
Thanks, my pleasure.